In 2019, I cut up a fir tree with my friend Gabe, and when we were done making the slabs out of the bigger logs, we cut sections out of the stump, thinking we could use them for something, as this was the biggest diameter of the tree, and it was a way to cut the stump down to a smaller size. I brought home 2 of the pieces and a bigger chunk that I still haven't done anything with. So I brought them back to the shop, and they were much heavier at this point. They're all end grain. They dry really fast, so they were really ready to use pretty quickly. This is the second of the 2 that I brought back. I made a coffee table out of the first one about a year or 2 ago. I cleaned the bark off. So a few months back, I came up with a drawing of a 40-tooth Lego gear. I had made a smaller version, I guess a bigger version of the gear, but a smaller version that I want to make now. That worked pretty well. And I've wanted to make that into a coffee table. So I thought it would be neat to take this section of the fir tree, as it's almost round, and cut the Lego gear into it and make it into a coffee table. So the first thing to do was to flatten the section. I can clamp the section to the CNC table and shim it up so the top is fairly level. Then flatten the top surface. Then flip the section over. Now the section that I just flattened sits perfectly on the table. The hold downs just keep the piece from sliding around. They don't actually hold it down. The weight of the piece does that. And I can do the other side. So I thought it would be fun to put ties into the crack that's in this section and sort of start this like it's a regular sort of normal in quotes, coffee table, then cut the gear into that. I wanted some contrast between the ties and the fir, so I found a piece of walnut I could use. I cut and then set those pieces up so that I could hold them on the CNC table on edge. So I could cut a very deep tie to put into the tabletop. So I glued some scrap pieces to the sides that I could clamp to. I cut the ends down a little bit so I could hold those down as well. Then I got a new 1/2-inch bit that I can use for this project. And I cut out the ties. So what I came up with was to make them bacon shaped. I did this on the door project a few years ago. I thought it was kind of fun. It's a nice shape in that it's long and skinny, but it also has waves in it so that it holds the pieces of wood together. And it's curvy, so it cuts well on the CNC machine. And I could cut these pieces apart. And they're bacon. So the idea was I could flip these over and push them into the fir. That's why I've left the little bottom tab on them. And of course this first one, I forgot to mirror the cut into the fir. So I had to actually sand off that tab on this first one. It worked just as well, it was just a little more work. The second 2, I remembered to mirror the cut into the fir. Once I've cut it, I can clean up the edges, and it usually takes a few passes to size it right so it fits nice and snug. It's nice when it's loose enough to go in, but tight enough that it doesn't need to be clamped down. You can just kind of pound it into place. I cut the other 2 mortises, I guess. Then it's just a matter of gluing these in place. So I can paint glue on the inside, then tap the pieces of bacon into place. Once that's dry, I can flatten the pieces that stick up. I just drew a circle and then just had it cut that out. So when I made this gear originally, I did it by doing a series of drawings and then cutting those drawings at different heights. So there isn't really a model of this gear, it's just a flat drawing. So it's what they call 2.5D CNC, where you're just cutting out shapes at different heights. So I can scale that drawing easily, but I need to have a spreadsheet of all the different heights so that when I scale the drawing by a certain factor, I can also scale all the heights by the same number, the same factor. So I can make the gear the same three-dimensional object. So I wanted to do a test of this. So I made a smaller gear out of plywood. It seemed to work well with the heights that I came up with. Also with this, I wanted to try an idea of cutting out the two sides of the gear and then just gluing the two sides together. And that was the way to get everything lined up. And as it's plywood, the seam disappears. This actually worked really well. So once I felt good about the model and the heights and my drawing, I could start cutting out the big table. And I started the first few passes, and it was going really well. And then I hit a nail. I had hit a nail on the other side when I was surfacing the other side of the piece. I wondered if it was this nail, and I had forgotten which side it was on, but this one seemed deeper than that piece of metal as it was on the surface on the other side. So I tried to dig the piece of metal out. It was sort of working. Then I remembered I had my Fairchild carving tool, and I found a little circular saw blade for it that actually worked pretty well. I could sort of cut a slot around the piece of metal. And I got most of it out, but then it felt like it broke off. I wondered if the piece I had found on the other side was in the same place, and it was. So I have a little bit of a nail problem. I've done a little bit of drawing on the piece, and I've found that the nail I hit on this side and the nail I hit on the other side seem to be in the same plane. And I'm hoping any other metal in this piece is also in that plane. I'm wondering if these aren't actually nails, they're pieces of fencing. They look a little bit more like that's what they could be. So my thought is to cut out a slot from this piece, not too different from what I've done in the past with wood-turned bowls, where I've cut out a section that I don't want, and then I'll make a piece to infill that and hopefully keep the width the same. I was thinking I would use walnut, so it would be similar to the bacon pieces, but I was looking around the shop and I found the extra pieces of random pattern that I used on the wastebasket project not too long ago. So I'm hoping I can use these pieces to infill that slot. And I think I have just enough. The one little issue with this is that the grain on the table runs this way, and the grain on these pieces runs this way. So that maybe will be a little bit of an issue with shrinking and expanding, but in the table piece, the wood mostly moves around the center and doesn't move so much in and out. But I really like the idea of using these scrap pieces. One, because they're scrap pieces and it sort of links this project to the other project, but also that these kind of have a scale of Lego pieces, which kind of fits with the idea of the table. I can start to cut out that section of the piece of fur. I used the same jig that I used to cut bowls on the bandsaw. I moved the bar clamp to the back of the sled so it can hold the section of fur. And I can make the first cut, and this actually worked really well. It gave me a nice straight cut. This bandsaw doesn't have a slot in the table, so I have to run the sled against the edge of the table. It works, but it's just a little different. Then I flipped everything over and I moved the sled over just slightly on the workpiece so I could make the second cut. As you can just see in this shot, I didn't quite get all of the nails, as in I cut through them on the first cut. So I had some more metal to get out. So I tried again digging these pieces out. I didn't know at this point if these were really short and they would just come out, or they were really long and they were going to not come out. I tried a few different ways of trying to grab that end of the metal, and they seemed like they were pretty well in there. My last attempt was to try and drill around the metal and see if I could loosen it up enough to be able to get it out. This first side, it seemed like I had gotten it, so I felt pretty good about that. So I went to work on the other side, and it seemed like it had no end. I kept just drilling deeper and deeper and deeper, and it just would not come out. I've got it clamped in the vice grips, and I'm hitting the vice grips with a hammer, trying to knock the piece of metal out. Even when I thought I had it out, I could still hear with my metal detector that there was metal in the piece. Back to the bandsaw, and I decided I would just cut this whole section off and just remake that part. I would just keep cutting until I got to clean wood without any metal in it. And I think I did one pass and there was still metal, so I did another cut. So once I had that cleaned up, I had to make a piece to infill what I had taken out. So I actually found a piece of alder that I've been using recently. And this is from a tree from the same property that we got the fir that I'm using in this project for. So the main tabletop and this piece of alder grew about 200 feet apart, maybe 75 meters apart. And I cleaned up the random section that I was going to use. And I glued up the blocks for the final infill that I'm going to do. The cut on the bandsaw was really good, but it wasn't quite glue joint good. So I sanded all of the cuts that I was going to glue back together again, just to get them nice and flat. And the blocks I glued together, I sanded. They were really close. This makes them perfect. Then I glued part of the fir back on, glued the alder in place. Now the alder was slightly out of plane with the rest of the cut. So I cut off the extra bit of alder and I sanded off the part that wasn't quite parallel with the fir. And then I decided I could try jointing this edge. It is side grain, but it's not really side grain in the right direction. It seemed to work just fine, so I could get those cuts perfect on the joiner. And I cleaned up the random pattern piece. Also, this piece had to be made the right thickness. I had marked on the pieces of fir what 2 inches should be. And if my strip is the right thickness, then those 2 points will be 2 inches apart. Then I could do the final glue up. And everything's ready to go back to cutting again. I had marked on the table where this should go, so it should be pretty close to the right location, or the same location, as I've started to cut the pattern, and I wanted to follow that. And I used my metal detector on this once it was all glued up, and it didn't find anything, so I think I'm metal free at this point. Cutting out all these holes takes about 45 minutes. So I've sped everything up, but it's really a sort of much slower process. This is sort of regular speed, which I think I did most things at 200 inches per minute. Some of the bigger cutting passes I did at 300, and some of the finish sort of cleaning up the insides of things passes I did it at like 160 inches per minute. And I could cut out the teeth. And one side is done. So now how do I flip this over and get it in the same location? So the idea I have is to clamp a secondary spoil board down to the table. I'm clamping it so the warp on the plywood comes up at the edges, so I can sort of flatten it down to the table with the hold downs. Then I can cut some scrap pieces of plywood and attach those to the big piece of plywood, or the sort of secondary spoil board, and they'll sort of be blocking. Maybe that's not quite the right term. They're just sort of mass. They're just sort of volume, I guess. The idea with these is to attach them in the right place so they fall where the holes in the gears are. And I can cut the positive sort of Lego bumps into these pieces of plywood. I decided I wanted to be able to clamp the edges on this, so I trimmed off just a little bit of the sides and reclamped everything down. Now I can cut the positive circles into these that will fit into the gear. And since I know my 0 point on this pass, I can use that same point in the computer and in the drawing of the gear so that I can have the gear flipped over and be in the right location if it's sitting on these pegs. But what I like about this is I'm using the concept of Lego bricks to hold the piece on the CNC machine. That's the big idea here. And with some fitting and a little cleaning up on the bumps, I can fit the gear onto those. I didn't realize when I was thinking about this that I wasn't going to be able to see the pieces going together. So it was a lot of moving the piece around until it fell into place. But it finally did, and it was pretty clear that it had fallen into the right place. So the Lego part of this holds the fur in the right location, but it doesn't really hold it well enough to run the CNC over it. So I added some screws on the outside edge of the fur. That'll end up being scrap in the end. I can cut the other side, or this will be the bottom of the coffee table. After all that work lining up the piece, I ended up accidentally unplugging my computer and losing the 0, location. So I had to kind of re-approximate it, so it isn't as perfect as I had hoped. In cutting the teeth, which will be the final pass and will free the gear from the rest of the fur, I wanted to have the center, or the gear part, held well and have the outside held with the screws that I put on earlier. So I clamped the gear section down to the piece of plywood, and this will mean when I cut the piece free, it won't move around, which might ding up whatever the final tooth is that it's on. I got started cutting the teeth, and then I thought my little piece of scrap plywood that are clamping everything down were probably going to be in the way, so I trimmed those down a little bit. Then I cut everything free, and it came apart. And of course my last pass wasn't quite deep enough, so it left a little bit of a burr in the center of the teeth. So the gear section is done. Now to make it a coffee table, it needs legs. I looked on the Lego website for maybe just making some sort of piece that the legs could be, but I didn't find anything too inspiring. One thought was to make the cross-shaped axle pieces be the legs, and that's definitely a possibility. But what I kept envisioning was to just make something that looked more like a regular in quotes, leg, and have that fit into the circles on the gear. So they're sort of like big specialty Lego pieces. I was going to do the legs out of walnut again, but I discovered I had a sort of a cap piece of a piece of maple that would be thick enough to make the pieces that I need for the legs. and I can cut those down on the bandsaw and get them to something close to usable. Now, I wouldn't really care what the sides are like, but I'm going to put this on the vertical CNC table, so I really need a flat jointed edge to help that hold and clamp work really well. So the idea is to cut a tenon into the end of this piece of maple. And those tenons will fit into the circles on the gear. Then I can turn the rest of the leg on the lathe and make sort of a round, nicely shaped leg. The thought, and this may sound a little bit like rationalization at this point, is that I won't glue these in place. They'll just be sort of a snug Lego fit. And at some point in the future, I can pull these off. What I'd really like to do is make another smaller gear and a structure underneath the two or even multiple gears that would hold them in place so that you'd have a coffee table where the gears rotate and you can move it, and it's a little bit more kinetic than just a thing. But for now, I'm just going to make legs just to get this done. I think for now, this project's really about the top and the gear, and the legs are just there to hold it up. I sanded and took that off, and I can cut the end off, and the first one's done. Now, on the other two, I cut the maple down to shape a little bit, so I didn't have as much to take off on the lathe, and this sped things up quite a bit. It's one that you don't have to remove as much, but it's also that you can turn the piece faster at the beginning because there's less mass rotating. Put those in place, they're nice and snug. I realized at this point I should have made the outside diameter of the leg match the outside diameter of the circles on the gears, but that's the architect in me, wanting things to line up. Even with pounding them in place, I can still pull them out. What could happen is the fur could shrink and make the legs really, really tight. Then I sprayed some lacquer on the piece. I really didn't want to try and paint that gear by hand. It's both intricate and end grain, so it'd be very hard to try and paint oil or something on that surface. Spraying it was a much better option. For now, we've got a little seating area off our dining room. It's the perfect place for a little coffee table. Also, the other idea, because I know the top of this doesn't really look like something you can put anything on, is to make coasters that fit into the circles on the gear. They're sort of like little Lego pieces that sit on the top of the table and give you a surface to put a coffee cup on or coffee mug on. Thanks for watching.